Imagine the sharp sting of sea salt on your face during the wildest storm of the year, a storm you prepared for, a storm you respect. Now imagine turning from the churning gray waves to see the one person who was the real storm in your life, the one who ripped through your world and left you to rebuild from the wreckage 8 years ago. Dr. Alastair Finch thought he had weathered that storm. He'd built a new life as a single father in the rugged coastal town of Port Blossom, Oregon, his hands shaping wood into furniture, his heart shaping a world for his 7-year-old son, Finn. But some storms have a way of circling back. Tonight, bundled in a bright yellow raincoat, mesmerized by the colossal waves crashing against the seawall, Finn will turn and ask a single question that will shatter the calm Alastair has so carefully constructed. One question that will force him to confront the past he buried, the love he lost, and the future he never thought possible. Before we dive into this torrent of emotion, please make sure you subscribe to our channel, click that notification bell so you never miss a story, and let me know in the comments what your favorite thing about a good storm is. The wind howled a mournful song against the old timbers of the Port Blossom Pier, a sound Alastair had come to find comforting. It was the sound of home, of nature's raw power held at a respectful distance. He zipped Finn's raincoat up to his chin, the little boy's face a perfect circle of awe as he stared at the spectacle of the Winter Storm Festival's main event, the King's Tide. Waves, monstrous and beautiful, exploded against the barrier rocks, sending plumes of white spray high into the bruised purple sky. "It's like the ocean is angry," Finn yelled over the wind, his voice laced with excitement, not fear. Alastair smiled, pulling the hood tighter around his son's head. "Not angry, buddy, just powerful. It's showing us what it can do." For 8 years, Alastair had been a single parent, a carpenter, a man defined by solid, tangible things. He built tables that would last a lifetime, repaired fishing boats that battled the sea, and raised a son who was as wild and wonderful as the coastline they called home. He'd chosen Port Blossom for its isolation, its ruggedness, a place where memories of a different life, a life in a bustling city with a man who dreamed of changing the world, couldn't easily find him. He thought he was safe. "Look at that one." Finn pointed a mittened hand towards the horizon, where a wave was gathering itself into a towering beast. "That's the biggest one yet." Alastair's gaze followed his son's, but something else caught his eye. A figure standing a little further down the pier, silhouetted against the tumultuous sky. They were tall, with a familiar set of broad shoulders and a way of standing, feet planted firmly apart as if daring the wind to move them. Alastair's heart gave a painful, unwelcome lurch. He shook his head, dismissing it. It was just a stranger, another tourist or local braving the weather for the festival. It couldn't be him. And then the figure turned. Time, which had been rushing forward with the wind and the waves, seemed to snag and stop. The face was older, etched with fine lines around the eyes, and a faint scar above his eyebrow that wasn't there before, but it was unmistakably the same face. Julian, the man he'd married in a sun-drenched city courthouse, the man who'd promised him a forever filled with adventure and discovery, the brilliant, ambitious scientist who'd walked away when Alastair's quiet dreams had clashed with his own roaring ambitions. Julian's dark hair was shorter, whipped into chaos by the wind. He wore a heavy, practical coat, not the stylish, tailored things Alastair remembered, but the eyes, when they found Alastair's across the distance, were the same. A startling, intelligent gray that could hold a universe of passion and an ocean of pain. Allie? The name was snatched by the wind, but Alistair heard it as clearly as if Julian had whispered it in his ear. His own name. A ghost from another lifetime. Alistair's mouth went dry. His carefully constructed world, the one he'd built with calloused hands and a guarded heart, began to tilt on its axis. 8 years of peace, of quiet healing, shattered in a single gut-wrenching moment of recognition. "Dad?" Finn's voice pulled him back. "Are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Julian's gaze dropped from Alistair's face to the small boy standing beside him. A flicker of confusion, then curiosity. Then a dawning, earth-shattering realization played out across his features. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. "Alistair," he said again, his voice stronger now, laced with a disbelief that mirrored Alistair's own. "What are you? Who is this?" Alistair's arm tightened instinctively around Finn's shoulders. "This is my son, Finn," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He had to force them out, each one a betrayal of the quiet life they'd built. "Finn, this is an old friend of mine, Julian." Finn, who had never known a moment of shyness in his life, looked up at the tall stranger with wide, curious eyes. He tilted his head, a gesture so painfully familiar it made Alistair's chest ache. "You have a sad face," Finn announced with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old. Julian's expression, already strained, seemed to crack. A faint, broken smile touched his lips. "I guess I do, kid." He crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with Finn. "I like your raincoat. Yellow's a very brave color." "It's my favorite," Finn said proudly. "It's the color of the sun, and the sun is brave because it comes back even after the biggest storm." The words, so innocent, landed with the force of a tidal wave. Alistair watched Julian flinch, saw the raw pain in his eyes. Julian had always been the sun in their relationship, bright and powerful, and sometimes too hot to stand. Alistair had been the steady earth, the quiet shore, until Julian had vanished over the horizon, chasing a new dawn. "That's a very smart way to think about it," Julian said, his voice rough. Alistair felt the need to flee, to grab Finn and run back to the safety of his workshop, to the scent of sawdust and the solid feel of wood beneath his hands. But his feet were bolted to the pier. He was trapped in the gravitational pull of the man he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Finn looked from Julian's face to Alistair's, his brow furrowed. He sensed the invisible crackling tension between them, the storm that had nothing to do with the weather. He tugged on Alistair's sleeve. "Dad," he said, his voice clear and piercing over the wind. He pointed a small, questioning finger at Julian. "Is that him?" The question hung in the salty air, more powerful than the gale. Alistair's blood turned to ice. "Is that who, buddy?" he asked, his voice a strangled whisper, already knowing the answer, already knowing the dam was about to break. Finn's gaze was unwavering. He looked at Julian, then back at his father, a puzzle piece clicking into place in his young mind. "My other dad," he said. The 2 words, not a question, but a statement of discovery, a truth spoken into the heart of the storm. Julian's face went white. He physically recoiled, staggering back a step as if Finn's words had been a physical blow. He stared at Alistair, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock, horror, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. "What?" Julian choked out, his gaze fixed on Alistair. "What did he say?" Alistair closed his eyes, the roar of the ocean filling his ears, a perfect echo of the chaos erupting in his soul. The secret he had carried for 7 years, a weight he'd grown so accustomed to, it felt like a part of his own skeleton had just been laid bare by the innocent logic of his son. When he opened his eyes, the past and present were colliding right there on the windswept pier, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Julian remained crouched, frozen, his eyes locked on Alistair's, silently pleading for an explanation, for a denial, for anything other than the impossible truth that was hanging between them. "Alistair," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Tell me what he meant." But Alistair couldn't speak. The words were lodged in his throat, a tangled mess of anger, grief, and a love he thought he'd long since buried. It was Finn, oblivious to the earthquake he'd just triggered, who spoke again. He looked at Julian, his head tilted. "You look like the picture in the box," he said matter-of-factly. "The one Dad keeps under his bed." The confirmation, so simple and so absolute, seemed to knock the air from Julian's lungs. He swayed, his hand reaching out to steady himself against a wooden piling. "The picture in the box," he repeated, his voice hollow. Alistair felt a hot flush of shame and fury. That box was his one concession to the past, a small wooden chest he'd crafted himself, filled with a handful of photographs and a single folded letter. It was a Pandora's box of a life he'd tried to forget, a life before Finn, a life with Julian. He'd never shown it to Finn, had never spoken of it, but children are detectives in their own homes, and Finn, with his insatiable curiosity, had clearly found it. "Finn, we need to go," Alistair said, his voice tight. He pulled gently on his son's arm, but Finn resisted. "But Dad, he's here. My other dad is here." Finn's voice was filled with a sense of wonder, not accusation. To him, this was a miracle, the solving of a mystery he hadn't even fully understood he was living. He didn't see the wreckage of the past. He saw a missing piece of his own story, suddenly and wonderfully present. Julian slowly rose to his feet, his movements stiff, his face a mask of disbelief. "You have a son," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. How old is he?" Alistair's jaw tightened. He owed this man nothing. Julian had made his choice 8 years ago when he'd packed his bags and walked out of their apartment, choosing a prestigious research grant in the Amazon over a life with Alistair. He'd chosen ambition over love, the unknown over the familiar. "He's 7, Alistair said, the words clipped. Julian's eyes widened further, the mental arithmetic clicking into place with horrifying speed. 7, he breathed. "That means, oh my God, Ali, that means you were, when I left, it means I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you walked out the door," Alistair finished, his voice cold and sharp. A blade meant to wound, to push Julian away. He needed to push him away before the old familiar ache in his chest could blossom into something more dangerous. The truth hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. His face, already pale, lost all its color. He looked from Alistair's hard, unforgiving expression to Finn's innocent, expectant face, and back again. The brilliant scientist, the man who could explain the most complex ecosystems on the planet, was utterly speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words adequate to fill the 8-year chasm that had just opened at his feet. "Why?" he finally managed to whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question, the one Alistair had both dreaded and rehearsed answers for in the dark of countless sleepless nights, ignited a fire of long-buried rage in his chest. "Tell you?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Why would I have told you? You were in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, unreachable for months. You'd made it perfectly clear what you wanted, and it wasn't me. It wasn't a quiet life. What was I supposed to do? Send a message by carrier pigeon? Hey, remember that life you didn't want? Well, it just got a lot more complicated. The bitterness in his own voice shocked him. He hadn't realized how much anger he still carried, how raw the wound still was. Julian flinched, as if Alistair had struck him. "I would have come back," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "God, Allie, you know I would have come back." "Would you?" Alistair's laugh was harsh. "Or would you have seen it as another anchor, another thing tying you down and keeping you from your grand destiny?" From the pier, people were starting to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the raw, unfolding drama. Alistair felt a surge of panic. This was his town, his safe harbor. He couldn't have this fight, this reckoning out here in public. "We can't do this here," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. He took Finn's hand, his grip firm. "It was a mistake seeing you. We're leaving." "No, wait." Julian's voice was desperate. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, afraid to touch, afraid to let go. "Please, Alistair, don't go. We have to. I need to understand." "There's nothing to understand," Alistair lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I have a son. You'll have your work. Our lives went in different directions. That's all." He turned to leave, pulling a confused and disappointed Finn with him. "But, Dad," Finn protested, looking back at the lonely figure on the pier. "Wait," Julian called out, his voice stronger now, more commanding. "Tomorrow. Coffee. The Salty Siren Cafe. 10 o'clock. Please, Allie. For him. If not for me, then for him. He deserves to know." The plea, wrapped around his son's name, was a direct hit. Alistair stopped, his back still to Julian. He looked down at Finn, at his son's upturned face, his eyes full of questions that Alistair no longer had the right to avoid answering. He had spent 7 years protecting Finn from a past he didn't understand, but in one fell swoop, that past had become his present. Avoiding it was no longer an option. Without turning, without making eye contact, Alistair gave a single sharp nod. Then he walked away, pulling his son with him, leaving Julian standing alone on the pier as the storm raged around them, a perfect mirror for the tempest that had just been unleashed in all their lives. The walk home was a blur. The wind and rain, which had seemed exhilarating just minutes before, now felt oppressive, each drop a tiny accusation against Alistair's skin. Finn was uncharacteristically quiet, his small hand clutching Alistair's tightly. He was processing, Alistair knew, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations, of a picture in a box of a stranger's sad face on a pier. Alistair's workshop, usually his sanctuary, felt like a cage. The scent of cedar and pine, the neat rows of tools, the solid weight of half-finished furniture, none of it could ground him. His carefully ordered world had been thrown into complete chaos. After he'd tucked a subdued Finn into bed, Alistair found himself pacing the worn wooden floors of his small house, his mind a maelstrom of memories and fears. He remembered the fight, the last one, the one that had ended everything. It hadn't been loud or violent. It had been worse. It had been quiet, a slow, painful dissection of their two incompatible futures. Julian, brilliant and restless, had been offered the opportunity of a lifetime, a 3-year research project deep in the heart of the Amazon, studying undiscovered ecosystems. It was the culmination of everything he'd worked for. Alistair, a carpenter who found beauty in stillness and permanence, had just put a down payment on a small workshop in a quiet neighborhood, a place to put down roots. "It's just 3 years, Allie," Julian had argued, his eyes shining with the thrill of discovery. "I'll come back. We can travel. We can see the world." "I don't want the world, Jules," Alistair had said, his heart aching. "I want a home. I want this home with you." The impasse had been absolute. Julian saw Alistair's dream as a cage, a settling for a life too small. Alistair saw Julian's dream as a rejection, a sign that he, Alistair, would never be enough to make him stay. In the end, Julian had chosen the Amazon. He'd packed his bags with promises of staying in touch, of making it work. But they both knew it was over. 2 weeks later, the positive pregnancy test had felt like a cruel joke. Alistair had been alone, heartbroken, and facing the terrifying prospect of single fatherhood. The thought of telling Julian had crossed his mind, of course, but the logistics were impossible. Julian was in a remote, off-grid research station. Communication was sporadic at best. And what would he have said? Surprise, the life you just ran away from is now a permanent reality. Pride, stubborn and fierce, had taken over. Alistair had convinced himself it was better this way. Julian had made his choice, unburdened by a child he didn't know existed. Alistair would build his own life, a life for him and his son on his own terms. He'd moved to Port Blossom, a place as far from their old life as he could get, and he had done it. He'd built a successful business, he had a home, he had Finn, and for 7 years it had been enough, or so he told himself. Now, standing in the quiet of his house, Alistair was forced to confront the lie he'd been living. He'd told himself he was protecting Finn, but was he? Or was he protecting himself from the pain of seeing Julian again, from the possibility of having his heart broken all over again? He went to his bedroom and pulled the small wooden box from under his bed. He opened it, the scent of old paper and cedar filling the air. There were only a few things inside: a picture of him and Julian on their wedding day, both of them ridiculously young and beaming with a hope that now seemed naive. A photo of Julian on a research trip, looking windswept and happy, his arm thrown around a colleague, a dried wildflower from their first hike together, and the letter. The last letter Julian had managed to get out of the Amazon 6 months after he'd left. It was full of descriptions of the jungle, of his work, of the incredible things he was seeing. But the last paragraph was the one that Alistair had read 1,000 times. The words seared into his memory. "I miss you, Allie, more than I thought possible. Sometimes, in the middle of this beautiful, terrible jungle, I realized that the greatest discovery I ever made was you. I hope you can forgive me for being too blind to see it sooner." Alistair had received that letter a month before Finn was born. He'd been tempted, so tempted, to write back, to tell him everything, but fear and pride had won. He'd folded the letter, put it in the box, and tried to move on. He'd told himself that Julian was just romanticizing their past, that once his grand adventure was over, he'd be off on the next one. He'd told himself he was making the right choice for his son, but looking at the letter now, with the reality of Julian's presence just a few blocks away, he felt a wave of doubt so strong it almost buckled his knees. What if he'd been wrong? What if he'd robbed his son of a father and robbed Julian of a son, all because he'd been too afraid to risk his own heart again? The storm outside rattled the windows, a perfect symphony for his own internal turmoil. He had a decision to make. He could cancel the meeting, pack up Finn, and run again. Or he could walk into that cafe tomorrow, face the man who was both a stranger and the other half of his soul, and confront the ghost that had haunted him for 8 long years. He thought of Finn's face on the pier, the dawning wonder in his eyes as he'd said, "My other dad." He thought of the quiet sadness in his son that he sometimes glimpsed, the unasked questions about where he came from. He owed it to Finn, he owed it to Julian, and maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself. He closed the box, slid it back under the bed, and went to check on his son. Finn was sleeping soundly, one arm thrown over his head, his face peaceful in the soft glow of his nightlight. Alistair smoothed the hair back from his forehead, his heart aching with a fierce, protective love. "It's gonna be okay, buddy," he whispered into the quiet room. "I don't know how, but we're gonna figure this out." But as he walked back to his own empty room, Alistair wasn't sure if he was making a promise or a prayer. The Salty Siren Cafe was the heart of Port Blossom, a cozy haven of worn wooden tables, the smell of roasted coffee, and the low hum of conversation from fishermen and artists alike. Alistair walked in at 10 o'clock on the dot, his stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying every possible version of this conversation, each one ending in more pain. Julian was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner, nursing a mug of coffee. He looked exhausted. His eyes were shadowed, and the new scar above his eyebrow seemed more pronounced in the morning light. He stood up the moment he saw Alistair, his movements jerky and uncertain. "You came," Julian said, his voice filled with a relief so profound it was almost tangible. "I came," Alistair confirmed, not sitting down. He remained standing, a defensive posture he wasn't even conscious of adopting. "Let's get one thing straight. I'm here for Finn, not for me, not for you. He has questions now, and I can't lie to him anymore. So we're going to figure out what to tell him. That's it." Julian nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "Okay," he said softly. "Anything, whatever you want." The deference, the complete lack of his old confident bluster, was disarming. Alistair reluctantly sat down, placing as much distance between them as the small table would allow. A waitress appeared, and Alistair ordered a black coffee, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. For a few moments, they sat in a heavy, suffocating silence. It was Julian who finally broke it. "He has my eyes," he said quietly, not looking at Alistair. "Not the color, but the shape. And he tilts his head when he's curious, just like my father did." The observation, so intimate and so true, was a crack in Alistair's armor. "He's smart," Alistair found himself saying, his voice softening against his will. "Too smart for his own good sometimes. He started reading when he was 4. He loves the ocean. He can name almost every creature in the tide pools." Julian looked up, his gray eyes glistening. "Tell me about him," he pleaded. "Please, Allie, tell me everything." And so, hesitantly at first, then with a growing momentum, Alistair did. He talked about Finn's birth, a long and difficult labor he'd endured alone. He talked about his first word, more, his first steps, his obsession with building elaborate structures out of driftwood on the beach. He talked about his kindness, his stubborn streak, his uncanny ability to know when Alistair was sad. He painted a portrait of a life, a vibrant, beautiful life that had been lived entirely in Julian's absence. Julian listened, completely rapt, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He didn't interrupt. He just absorbed every word, his expression shifting from wonder to awe to a deep, profound sorrow. "I missed it all," he whispered when Alistair finally fell silent. "His whole life, I missed it all." "You made your choice, Julian," Alistair said, his defensiveness returning. "You wanted to be out there. discovering new worlds. This was just the world you left behind. I was an idiot, Julian said, his voice raw. I was a selfish, arrogant idiot who thought my work was the most important thing in the universe. I thought I could have it all, the career, the adventure, and you waiting for me when I was done. It was the biggest miscalculation of my life. He finally looked Alistair directly in the eye, and the pain there was so naked, so vast, that Alistair had to fight the urge to look away. I came back, Julian said. After the 3 years, I came back to our apartment, but you were gone. The landlord said you'd moved out over 2 years ago and left no forwarding address. I looked for you, Allie. I hired a private investigator. I spent months searching, but you'd vanished. It was like you'd never existed. The confession stunned Alistair into silence. He'd never considered that Julian might have come looking for him. In his narrative, Julian had simply moved on to the next grand adventure. Why didn't you try to contact me in the Amazon? Alistair asked. The old question surfacing again. Why didn't you answer my letter? What letter? Julian asked, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. The letter you sent. The one where you said I was the greatest discovery you ever made. Julian's face went pale. The letter I gave to Dr. Evans to mail for me when he was leaving the research station? Ali, he was in a helicopter crash on his way out of the jungle. He survived, but most of his equipment and personal effects were lost. I always assumed the letter was lost with him. You got it? I got it, Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. The foundation of the story he told himself for 8 years began to crumble. The narrative of abandonment, of being forgotten, was suddenly full of holes. I waited, Julian continued, his voice thick with regret. I waited for a reply, and when I never got one, I assumed you'd moved on, that you hated me for leaving. I didn't blame you, but I never stopped loving you. I never stopped thinking about you. He reached across the table, his hand covering Alistair's. Allie, finding out about Finn, it's the most incredible, devastating thing that has ever happened to me. I know I have no right to ask for anything. I know I screwed up in every way a person can screw up, but please don't shut me out. Let me meet him. Let me get to know my son. His plea was stripped of all pride, all ego. It was the raw, desperate request of a man who had just discovered a universe he never knew he'd lost. Alistair looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his own fingers, intertwined with the smooth, scholarly hands of the man he'd once loved more than life itself. The anger that had sustained him for so long was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a confusing, terrifying sea of sorrow and what felt dangerously like hope. He pulled his hand away slowly. I need to think, he said, his voice shaky. It's too much. He stood up, dropping a few dollars on the table for his coffee. I'll call you, he said, turning to leave. Alistair. Julian's voice stopped him at the door. What are you doing in Port Blossom? Your work? Your life was in the city. Julian's question was simple, but the answer was anything but. I'm the lead researcher at the Marine Biology Institute just up the coast, he said. I moved here 6 months ago. Alistair stared at him, his mind reeling. Julian wasn't just passing through. He lived here, in his town. His safe harbor was no longer safe. It was now the epicenter of the biggest storm he would ever face. Alistair drove home from the cafe in a daze, the stunning revelation that Julian lived just up the coast echoing in his mind. It wasn't a chance encounter, it was an inevitability. Their two solitary orbits had finally, catastrophically, collided. For 6 months, the man who was the center of his past had been living just miles away, breathing the same salty air, walking the same rugged coastline. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. When he got home, the house was too quiet. The silence pressed in on him, amplifying the frantic thrumming of his own heart. He walked into Finn's room, a sanctuary of colorful drawings, stacks of books about sea creatures, and neatly organized Lego creations. On Finn's desk was a new drawing. It was a picture of the pier from the night before. On one side was a stick figure with brown hair, labeled Dad. On the other was a taller stick figure with dark hair, labeled with a single large question mark. In the middle was a small figure in a yellow raincoat, his arms stretched out, reaching for both of them. Alistair's throat tightened. He had tried to build a world for Finn that was whole and complete, a world where the absence of a second parent wasn't a gaping wound, but the drawing told a different story. It showed a boy trying to bridge a gap he didn't understand, reaching for a phantom limb he'd always felt was missing. The decision he had to make was no longer just about his own pain or Julian's regret. It was about the small boy in the yellow raincoat who deserved a complete picture, not one filled with question marks. He spent the rest of the day in his workshop, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of his work. He planed a length of cedar, the sharp, clean scent filling the air, the rhythmic scrape of the tool a comforting mantra. But his hands were moving on autopilot. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of past and present. He remembered Julian's face in the cafe, the raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. He remembered the story of the lost letter, a small, tragic accident that had altered the course of all their lives. The anger he had clung to for so long was gone, leaving behind a vast, empty space filled with a confusing mix of sorrow and a fragile, terrifying hope. He had built his life on the foundation of Julian's abandonment. He had defined himself as the one who stayed, the one who was left behind. But what if that foundation was faulty? What if they were both just victims of circumstance, of bad timing, of a love that was powerful but not yet wise enough to navigate the currents of two different dreams? Late that afternoon, Finn came into the workshop, his expression serious. "Dad," he said, "can I ask you something?" Alistair put down his tools, giving his son his full attention. "Always, buddy." "Was that man, Julian, was he really my other dad?" The question was direct, with no room for evasion. Alistair took a deep breath. It was time for the truth, or at least a version of it a 7-year-old could understand. "Yes," he said softly, "he is." Finn absorbed this, his brow furrowed. "So you were married, like in the picture?" Alistair's heart clenched. "Yes, a long time ago, before you were born, Julian and I were married. We loved each other very much." "Then why did he leave?" Finn's voice was small, but the question was enormous. This was the precipice. Alistair could paint Julian as the villain, the one who walked away. It would be easier. It would justify his own choices. Or he could try to explain the more complicated, painful truth. Sometimes grown-ups want different things. Alistair began carefully. "I wanted to build a quiet life here, making things with my hands. Julian, he's a scientist. He wanted to travel the world and make big discoveries. We both had big dreams, but they were taking us in different directions. So he left to follow his dream. But he didn't know about me?" Finn asked, his eyes wide with the injustice of it. "No," Alistair said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "He didn't know about you. I found out you were on your way after he was already gone, and he was in a place that was very, very hard to reach. He had to be careful here. He couldn't burden Finn with the full weight of his own pride and fear. So he didn't leave me," Finn said, a wave of relief washing over his face. "He just left you." The innocent words were a punch to the gut. "It's more complicated than that, buddy," Alistair said, his voice thick. "But no, he didn't leave you. He never would have. He was surprised to find that he believed it. The Julian he'd seen in the cafe, the man devastated by the revelation of his son, would never have willingly walked away from him. Finn seemed satisfied with this for now. Is he going to be my dad now? Like, for real? The question was full of a hope that both warmed and terrified Alistair. We're going to figure that out, Finn. He really wants to get to know you. Would you like that? Finn's head bobbed in an enthusiastic nod. Can we go to the aquarium? He works at the aquarium, right? Maybe he knows the giant octopus. Her name is Ursula. Alistair smiled, a genuine smile for the first time that day. Of course, Finn would connect Julian to a giant octopus. I think that's a great idea, he said. Later that evening, after Finn was asleep, Alistair picked up his phone. He scrolled to the number Julian had written on a napkin at the cafe. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long time. This was it. This was the moment he let the storm back into his life, not as a force of destruction, but as something new, something unknown. He pressed the button. Julian answered on the first ring, his voice breathless with anxiety. Hello? It's Alistair. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Ali, I didn't think you'd call. Finn wants to go to the aquarium, Alistair said, deciding to get straight to the point. He wants to meet the giant octopus, and he wants to meet you. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with emotion. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was choked. Yeah? Yeah, Alistair confirmed. I told him you were his other dad. I told him you didn't know about him. He wants to get to know you. When? Julian asked, his voice filled with a desperate eagerness. Whenever you're free. He wants to know if you can introduce him to Ursula. A small, wet laugh came through the phone. I'm the lead on the cephalopod enrichment program. I know Ursula very well. I can arrange a private meeting after hours, if you want. He would love that, Alistair said. Saturday, around 5? Saturday at 5 is perfect, Julian said, his voice regaining some of its old confident energy. Allie, thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. I'm not doing this for you, Julian, Alistair reminded him, though the words lacked their earlier bite. I'm doing it for him. I know, Julian said softly, and that's more than I deserve. After they hung up, Alistair stood by the window, looking out at the dark, restless ocean. He felt a profound sense of shifting, as if the tectonic plates of his own life were rearranging themselves. He was terrified. He was hopeful. He was stepping into a future he had never imagined, a future with a past that was very much alive. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone. The week leading up to their visit to the aquarium was a strange limbo. Alistair found himself constantly on edge, a low-level hum of anxiety running through him at all times. He caught himself checking his phone, half expecting, half dreading a message from Julian. None came. Julian, it seemed, was respecting his need for space, a level of consideration that the younger Julian would have been incapable of. Finn, on the other hand, was vibrating with an almost unbearable level of excitement. Do you think Julian has ever touched a giant squid? Do you think he knows how to talk to dolphins? Do you think he misses being married to you? That last question, dropped casually while they were making pancakes, had nearly made Alistair drop the spatula. Buddy, that's a complicated question, he'd stammered. But you loved him, right? Finn pressed, his gaze serious. You said you did. Yes, Alistair admitted, his voice quiet. I loved him very much. So why did you stop? Alistair knelt down, looking his son in the eye. I don't think I ever really did, he confessed. The admission startling him with its raw honesty. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, the first time he'd allowed the thought to fully form. The anger and the hurt had been a shield, but beneath it, the love had remained dormant and waiting. Finn seemed to accept this with his usual 7-year-old wisdom. "Okay," he said, as if that explained everything. "Can I have more syrup?" When Saturday finally arrived, the air was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant cloudless blue. It felt like a good omen. As they drove up the coast to the Institute, Alistair felt his own anxiety being slowly replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Seeing Finn's unrestrained joy was infectious. Julian was waiting for them at the staff entrance, looking just as nervous as Alistair felt. He was dressed in casual jeans and a sweater, a stark contrast to the lab coat Alistair had always pictured him in. "Hi," he said, his smile tentative. "Hi," Alistair replied. Finn, however, wasted no time on pleasantries. "Are we going to see Ursula now?" he demanded, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Julian's face broke into a genuine, warm smile. "We are," he said, his gaze fixed on Finn. "But first, I have something for you." He handed Finn a small laminated card with his picture on it. It read, "Finn Finch Thorne, Junior Cephalopod Specialist." Finn's eyes went wide. He stared at the card, then up at Julian. "My name has 2 names?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Alistair's heart skipped a beat. They hadn't talked about this, hadn't even considered it, but Julian had done it, had linked their names together on a simple ID card, creating a bridge between their 2 separate worlds. He looked at Julian, a silent question in his eyes. Julian's gaze met his, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "Don't worry, we'll talk about it later." "Well, you have 2 dads," Julian explained to Finn, "so it makes sense that you'd have 2 last names." It was a simple, elegant solution. Alistair felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed him. The tour of the aquarium was magical. With the facility closed to the public, it was eerily quiet. The only sounds the gentle hum of the filtration systems and the soft bubbling of the tanks. Julian was in his element, his passion for his work shining through as he explained the intricate ecosystems to a wide-eyed Finn. He didn't dumb things down. He spoke to Finn as if he were a colleague, using scientific terms and then explaining them in a way that was both engaging and respectful. Alistair found himself watching them, a silent observer to this strange, beautiful first meeting. He saw the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the deep sea, a passion that had once felt like a rival, but now just seemed like an intrinsic part of who he was. And he saw the way Julian looked at Finn, with a mixture of awe, reverence, and a profound, heartbreaking sadness for all the time he had lost. Finally, they arrived at the main attraction, the giant Pacific octopus tank. Ursula was magnificent, a mesmerizing creature of intelligence and grace. She was pressed against the glass, her tentacles slowly undulating. "She's beautiful," Finn whispered, his face inches from the acrylic. "She is," Julian agreed, his voice soft. He came to stand beside Finn, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was the first time he touched him, and Alistair held his breath. Finn, instead of flinching, leaned into the touch. "She's recognizing you," Julian said. "Octopuses are incredibly smart. They can recognize individual human faces." He turned to a small control panel on the wall. For the next half hour, Alistair watched as Julian and Finn worked together, solving a puzzle to release food into Ursula's tank. He watched Julian guide Finn's small hands, his voice patient and encouraging. He watched his son, completely absorbed and utterly happy. working side by side with the father he had just met. It was a scene Alistair had never allowed himself to imagine, a perfect, painful tableau of what could have been. As they were leaving, walking through the darkened, empty halls of the aquarium, Finn slipped his hand into Julian's. "This was the best day ever," he declared. "I'm glad you think so, buddy," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. His eyes met Alistair's over Finn's head, and in them, Alistair saw a silent, grateful plea. When they reached the car, Alistair knew he couldn't just leave. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, and he was tired of fighting it. "We're having pizza for dinner," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully processed them. "If you're not busy, you could join us." Julian's face, already full of a fragile joy, seemed to illuminate from within. "I'm not busy," he said quickly. I'd love that. I'd love that very much." As they drove back to Alistair's small house in Port Blossom, a comfortable silence settled between the two men. It wasn't a solution, and it wasn't a promise, but for the first time in 8 years, it felt like a beginning. The evening unfolded with a surreal sense of domesticity that left Alistair feeling both disoriented and strangely at peace. Julian followed them back to the house, his car a dark, unfamiliar shape in the driveway next to Alistair's old, reliable truck. As they walked inside, Alistair was acutely aware of Julian taking in the details of his life. It was a life built without him, a life he was now a guest in. "This is a great house," Julian said, his voice quiet, his eyes scanning the photos on the mantelpiece. They were all of Finn. Finn on his first day of school. Finn with a gap-toothed grin holding up a small fish. Finn covered in mud after a day spent exploring the tide pools. There were no pictures of Alistair, and certainly none of them together. It was a shrine to his son, a visual record of the world he'd built for the two of them. "I like it," Alistair said simply. "It's small, but it's home." While Alistair called in the pizza order, Julian and Finn sat on the floor, Finn proudly showing him his most prized Lego creations. Alistair watched them from the kitchen, a dull ache in his chest. It was so easy, so natural. Julian listened with rapt attention as Finn explained the intricate backstory of his Lego spaceship, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions. He was a natural father, a fact that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. The pizza arrived, and they ate it, sitting on the living room floor, a makeshift picnic that felt more intimate than any fancy dinner. Finn, high on excitement and sugar, dominated the conversation, regaling Julian with stories about his school, his best friend, and his ambitious plans to build a submarine so he could visit Ursula whenever he wanted. Julian was the perfect audience, laughing at the right moments and treating Finn's wildest ideas with the seriousness of a scientific proposal. Alistair found himself relaxing, the tension that had been coiled in his shoulders for days slowly beginning to unwind. He was seeing a new Julian, a man stripped of the restless ambition that had once defined him. This Julian was quieter, more watchful. His focus narrowed to the small, miraculous boy sitting between them. After dinner, it was Finn's bedtime. "Will you read me a story?" Finn asked, looking directly at Julian. "Both of you?" Alistair's heart clenched, but he nodded. "Of course, buddy." They trooped upstairs to Finn's room, and Alistair was once again struck by the strangeness of the situation. Julian stood in the doorway of his son's bedroom for the first time, his gaze lingering on the glow in the dark stars on the ceiling, the carefully curated bookshelf, the small, messy bed. It was a sacred space, and Julian seemed to understand that. entering with a quiet reverence. Finn chose his favorite book, a beautifully illustrated story about a lost whale searching for its family. Alistair sat on one side of the bed, Julian on the other. They took turns reading pages, their voices weaving together to tell the story. Alistair was acutely aware of Julian's proximity, the warmth of his body, the familiar cadence of his voice. It felt like a memory from a dream, a life he'd almost lived. When the story was over, Finn was sleepy, but fighting it, clearly not wanting the day to end. Alistair tucked him in, kissing his forehead. "Good night, buddy. I love you." "I love you too, Dad." Then Finn looked at Julian, his eyes wide and hopeful. Julian leaned forward, his movements hesitant. He gently smoothed Finn's hair back from his forehead, his touch feather light. "Good night, Finn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the best day of my life getting to meet you." Finn smiled, a sleepy, contented smile. "You too," he mumbled, his eyes fluttering closed. They stood in the hallway for a moment, the quiet hum of Finn's nightlight filling the space between them. "He's incredible," Julian whispered, his back against the wall, as if he needed its support. "You've done an amazing job, Allie." "He's a good kid," Alistair said, a lump forming in his throat. They went back downstairs, the easy chatter of the evening replaced by a more charged silence. The elephant that had been patiently waiting in the corner had now moved to the center of the room. "About the name on the ID card," Alistair began, needing to address it. "I didn't mean to presume," Julian said quickly. It came out. When I was ordering it, it felt wrong for him to only have one of our names. It felt like he was missing a part of himself. I can get it changed if you—" "No," Alistair interrupted. "Don't. I like it. Finch Thorne. It sounds right." The admission hung in the air, a small offering, a step across the chasm that separated them. Julian looked at him, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I've been thinking," Julian said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "about us, about the past. I was wrong, Allie, so completely and utterly wrong. I spent years chasing discoveries all over the world, collecting accolades, building a career, but none of it feels as real as what I saw in this house tonight." He took a step closer. "I know I have no right to ask this, and I know it's too soon, but I have to know. Is there any chance for us? Is there any part of you that could ever forgive me enough to try again?" The question, the one Alistair had been simultaneously dreading and longing for, landed with a quiet intensity. He thought of his confession to Finn, the startlingly honest admission that he'd never really stopped loving this man. He looked at Julian, at the plea in his eyes, at the vulnerability that had replaced his old, unshakable confidence. He was terrified. His entire life, the safe, predictable world he had built, was on the verge of being upended. But he was also tired of being safe. He was tired of living a half-life, a life defined by loss. "I don't know," Alistair said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said all day. "I'm scared, Julian. You shattered my heart, and I've spent 8 years carefully gluing the pieces back together. I don't know if I can survive it breaking again." "I won't break it," Julian said, his voice a low, fervent promise. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure it stays whole, making sure you're happy, making sure Finn is happy." "Finn is the most important thing here," Alistair said, his voice firm. "He can't get attached to you and then watch you leave when the next big adventure comes along." "There are no more adventures," Julian said, with a certainty that shook Alistair to his core. The only adventure I want is this one, right here, learning how to be a father, learning how to be your partner again, if you'll let me." He closed the small distance between them, his hands coming up to cup Alistair's face. His touch was hesitant, gentle, as if he were holding something infinitely precious and fragile. "I love you, Alistair," he whispered. "I never stopped, not for a single day." Before Alistair could process, before he could think, before he could let his fear take over, Julian leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a passionate, demanding kiss. It was a kiss of apology, of reverence, of 8 years of unspoken longing. And in that moment, Alistair's carefully constructed walls, the ones he had spent so long building, came crashing down. He didn't kiss back, not at first. He was frozen, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions. The grief, the anger, the love, the hope. It was all there, swirling together in a chaotic, terrifying mix. Julian pulled back slightly, his eyes searching Alistair's, his expression full of a new, heart-wrenching fear, the fear of rejection. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his hands dropping from Alistair's face. I shouldn't have." He started to turn away, to retreat, and the thought of him leaving again, of this moment ending in another departure, was more than Alistair could bear. "Don't!" Alistair said, his voice rough. He reached out, his hand catching Julian's wrist. The contact was a spark, an anchor. "Don't go." Julian stopped, his back still to Alistair, his shoulders tense. I need time, Julian," Alistair said, his voice shaking. "This is a lot. You're a lot. You walk back into my life, and in less than a week, my entire world is upside down. I can't just flip a switch and go back to the way things were." "I'm not asking you to," Julian said, turning to face him again. His face was a mess of hope and despair. "I know things can't go back. I just want to know if we can go forward, together." The plea was so simple, so raw. Alistair looked at the man standing in his living room, a man who was both a ghost from his past and a tangible, breathing possibility for his future. He thought of Finn, sleeping peacefully upstairs, a boy who had spent his whole life with a question mark for a father. He thought of the drawing, of the small figure reaching for both of them, and he thought of himself, of the quiet loneliness that had been his constant companion for 8 years, a loneliness he'd mistaken for peace. "I don't know how to do this," Alistair admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to trust you again." "Then let me earn it," Julian said, his voice urgent. "Let me show you, day by day. Let me be there for Finn. Let me be there for you. Let me fix the things I broke." A real, honest-to-God storm was brewing outside, the wind beginning to pick up, rattling the old windows of the house. It felt fitting, a perfect reflection of the turmoil inside. "There's a big storm coming in tonight," Alistair said, his gaze drifting to the window. "The whole town is shutting down tomorrow." "I know," Julian said. "I should probably go before it gets too bad." The thought of him driving away, of being alone in the house with the storm and his own chaotic thoughts, filled Alistair with a sudden, sharp panic. "Stay," he said, the word escaping before he could stop it. Julian's eyes widened. "What?" "Stay," Alistair repeated, his voice firmer now. "The guest room, the couch is a pull-out. It's not safe to drive in this, just stay." It was an impulsive offer, born of fear and a flicker of something he wasn't ready to name. But it felt right. He wasn't ready to let Julian into his heart again, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, he could let him into his home. For one night, for the storm. Julian stared at him, a universe of unspoken emotions passing between them: gratitude, relief, and a deep, soul-shaking love. "Okay," he said softly, "I'll stay." As the first drops of rain began to lash against the windows, Alistair went to get blankets for the couch. He was terrified. He was confused. But for the first time in a very long time, as the storm gathered its fury outside, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of safety. He wasn't facing it alone. The storm that rolled in that night was one for the Port Blossom history books. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the house into a sudden, deep darkness. Alistair, who had weathered dozens of these coastal storms, felt a familiar calm settle over him. He knew the drill. He found the emergency candles and the big flashlight, his movements sure and practiced in the dark. But this time was different. He wasn't alone. "Everyone okay?" Julian's voice came from the living room, steady and reassuring. "We're good," Alistair called back. "Just a power outage. It happens." He found Julian in the living room, his form silhouetted by the faint gray light filtering through the windows. He was standing by the glass, looking out at the tempest. "This is incredible," Julian said, his voice full of the old familiar awe he always had for the raw power of nature. A loud crack of thunder shook the house, and a small cry came from upstairs. "Dad!" Alistair was already moving, but Julian was right behind him. They met at the bottom of the stairs, the beams of their flashlights crossing in the dark. "I'll go," Alistair said. "No, let's both go," Julian replied, and Alistair for once didn't argue. They found Finn sitting bolt upright in his bed, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, buddy," Alistair said, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling his son into a hug. "It's just a thunderstorm." "It's a loud one," Finn whimpered into his father's shoulder. "The loudest ones are the most exciting." Julian's voice came from the doorway. He walked into the room, his flashlight beam playing on the ceiling. "You know, when I was a kid, my dad used to tell me that thunder was just the sound of giants bowling in the clouds." Finn peeked out from Alistair's embrace, his fear momentarily forgotten. "Really?" "Absolutely," Julian said, coming to sit on the other side of the bed. "And the lightning? That's when they get a strike, and all the lights in the bowling alley flash on and off." The simple, imaginative story worked its magic. Finn's tense little body began to relax. "Are the giants good at bowling?" he asked, his voice sleepy. "The best," Julian said softly. "But sometimes they get a little carried away." They sat there for a long time, the three of them huddled together in Finn's small bed, cocooned in the darkness as the storm raged outside. Julian told Finn more stories, tales of his travels, of strange and wonderful creatures in far-off lands. He spoke of glowing fungi in the Amazon, of whale sharks in the Philippines, of the incredible silent world of the deep sea. Alistair listened, his son tucked safely against his side, the man who had broken his world now calmly and carefully helping to hold it together. The anger he had harbored for so long felt like a distant memory. In its place was something new, something fragile and warm. He was seeing the man he had first fallen in love with, the passionate, brilliant storyteller who saw wonder in everything. Sometime after midnight, the storm began to subside, its fury spent. The thunder softened to a distant grumble, and the rain gentled to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Finn had long since fallen asleep, his breathing deep and even between them. Carefully, Alistair and Julian extracted themselves from the bed. tucking the blankets around their son. They stood in the hallway, the silence of the house thick with unspoken words. "Thank you," Alistair whispered, "for that. You were good with him." "He's easy to be good with," Julian replied, his voice rough with emotion. "He's the best thing I've ever seen." They made their way back downstairs, the emergency candles casting long dancing shadows on the walls. They sat in the living room, not on opposite ends of the room, but on the same couch, a comfortable distance between them. "I meant what I said, you know," Julian said into the darkness. "About there being no more adventures. I got the offer of a lifetime about a year ago, a fully funded 5-year expedition to Antarctica. It was the pinnacle, the kind of thing I dreamed of since I was a kid." Alistair's heart gave a painful throb. This was it. This was the proof that he could never change. "And?" Alistair asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I turned it down," Julian said simply. Alistair stared at him, stunned. "You what? Why?" "Because I was miserable," Julian confessed, his voice raw with a pain that was years old. "I was standing on a research vessel in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by the most incredible beauty imaginable, and all I could feel was this profound, crushing emptiness. I had achieved everything I ever wanted, and it meant nothing because you weren't there. I realized that all my running, all my chasing of the next big thing, it was all just a distraction. I was running from the fact that I had left the only home I'd ever really had." He turned to Alistair, his gray eyes luminous in the candlelight. "I came to Port Blossom because I was done running. I wanted a quiet life. I took the job at the Institute because it was good work, but it was stationary. I bought a small house. I was trying to learn how to be still. I had no idea you were here, I swear. But finding you, finding Finn, it feels like the universe has given me a second chance, a chance to finally come home." The confession, so stripped of ego, so full of a hard-won wisdom, shattered the last of Alistair's defenses. The story he told himself about Julian, the ambitious, restless man who could never be happy in one place, was no longer true. Maybe it had never been. People change, people grow, and sometimes they find their way back. "Jules," Alistair said, his voice thick. He didn't know what to say. The years of pain and misunderstanding couldn't be erased with a single conversation. But the love, the deep, foundational love he had for this man was undeniable. It was there, in the quiet space between them, as real and as powerful as the storm outside. He didn't have to say anything. Julian seemed to understand. He reached out, not to touch, but just to hold his hand open in the space between them, an invitation. Slowly, hesitantly, Alistair placed his own hand in Julian's. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect, familiar fit. They didn't speak. They just sat there, holding hands in the dark as the storm passed and the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future, but it was a start. It was a quiet, shared moment of truce, of forgiveness, of two people who had been lost in their own separate storms, finally finding a safe harbor together. The morning after the storm was beautiful, the world washed clean and glistening under a soft, pearly light. The power was still out, but the silence was peaceful, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the distant cry of gulls. Alistair woke on the couch, a blanket tucked around him, to the smell of coffee. He sat up, disoriented, to find Julian in the kitchen, working by the light of the gas stove, a camping percolator bubbling away. He was moving around the space with a quiet, familiar ease that sent a pang of longing through Alistair's chest. "Morning," Julian said softly, his back still to him. "I figured you could probably use this." He poured a mug of steaming coffee and handed it to Alistair. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in a long time," Alistair admitted, and he was surprised to find it was true. Despite the emotional upheaval, despite sleeping on the couch, he felt a deep sense of peace, a quietening of the storm inside him. "Me too," Julian said, his eyes meeting Alistair's over the rim of his own mug. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence they used to share, filled with unspoken understanding. It was broken by the sound of small feet thundering down the stairs. "The power's out," Finn announced with glee, as if it were the greatest gift in the world. "Can we make blanket forts?" He skidded to a halt in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene. His two fathers, sharing coffee in the quiet post-storm morning. A slow smile spread across his face. "Are you staying for breakfast?" he asked Julian, his voice full of hope. "If it's okay with your dad," Julian said, his gaze flicking to Alistair. Alistair looked at his son, at his hopeful, happy face, and then at Julian, at his patient, waiting expression. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was being overshadowed by a new, more powerful feeling, the feeling of rightness, of home. "It's okay with his dad," Alistair said, and the smile he received from Julian was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The day unfolded with a slow, magical quality. With no power, there were no distractions, no television, no computers, no phones. They spent the morning building an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, a sprawling castle of sheets and pillows. They told stories inside its cozy darkness, their faces illuminated by flashlight. Julian, it turned out, was a master fort builder and an even better storyteller, weaving tales of brave explorers and mischievous sea creatures that had Finn completely captivated. In the afternoon, they bundled up and walked down to the beach to assess the storm's aftermath. The beach was a treasure trove of debris, a chaotic, beautiful mess of driftwood, seaweed, and shells. They spent hours exploring, Finn running ahead, his pockets bulging with his finds. Alistair and Julian walked side by side, a comfortable space between them, their conversation easy and light. They talked about their work, about the town, about Finn. They carefully avoided the deeper, more painful topics, both of them seeming to understand that today was for rebuilding, for laying a new solid foundation. "He's amazing, Ali," Julian said, watching Finn try to drag a massive piece of driftwood across the sand. "He's so confident, so curious." "He gets that from you," Alistair said without thinking. Julian stopped walking, looking at him with surprise. "You think so?" "I know so," Alistair said, a small smile playing on his lips. "You were always the one who wanted to see what was over the next horizon. He has the same spirit." "And he has your kindness," Julian said softly, "and your loyalty. I saw it on the pier. He was protecting you." The observation was so astute, so tender, that Alistair felt his cheeks flush. They continued walking, the shared moment of recognition hanging between them. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the calm sea, they sat on a large piece of driftwood, watching Finn chase the last of the waves. "I have something I need to tell you," Julian said, his voice serious. Alistair braced himself. "I've been offered a promotion at the Institute, head of the entire research department." Alistair's heart sank. This was it. The other shoe dropping, more responsibility, longer hours, more travel. "Congratulations," he said, his voice flat. That's great." "I'm turning it down," Julian said, his gaze steady on Alistair's face. "I'm taking a different position instead. Head of the Educational Outreach Program. It's less prestigious, less money, but it's regular hours, no travel. It's a 9-to-5 job, Ali. A job that lets me be here, for dinner, for bedtime stories, for him." The sacrifice was enormous. Julian was a world-class researcher, a man at the top of his field. To willingly step back, to choose a quieter, less celebrated path. It was the ultimate proof that he had changed. It was an act of love so profound it left Alistair speechless. "You don't have to do that," Alistair finally managed to say. "Yes, I do," Julian said firmly. "My ambition cost me 8 years with my son. It cost me you. I won't let it cost me anything else. This is my choice. This is what I want." He reached out and took Alistair's hand, his fingers lacing through his. "I want this, a boring, wonderful 9-to-5 life. With you, with Finn, if you'll have me." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. Alistair looked at their joined hands, then at Julian's earnest, hopeful face, and then at his son, a small, joyful silhouette against the vastness of the ocean. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'll have you." Julian's face broke into a radiant smile. He brought Alistair's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. As they walked back to the house, Finn ran to join them, slipping his small hand into their clasped ones, completing the circuit. "I'm hungry," he announced. "Me too," Alistair said, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Let's go home and make dinner." And as he said the word home, he looked at Julian, and he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he wasn't just talking about the small house waiting for them. He was talking about the three of them, together. A family reforged by a storm, a family finally whole. The months that followed were a masterclass in rebuilding. It was slow, careful work, like restoring a beautiful old piece of furniture that had been left out in the rain. There were moments of breathtaking beauty and moments of frustrating, painstaking detail. They didn't rush. They decided that Julian would keep his house for a while, that they would date, that they would give Finn and themselves time to adjust to their new reality. It was a strange and wonderful courtship. Their dates were often family affairs, hiking in the coastal forests, building epic sandcastles on the beach, and spending countless hours at the aquarium, where Finn was now a regular and beloved fixture. But there were also quiet evenings after Finn was asleep, where they would sit and talk for hours, carefully excavating the ruins of their past. They talked about the breakup, about the pain and the misunderstandings, about the years they had spent apart. Each conversation was a careful act of trust, a peeling back of layers of scar tissue to get to the healthy heart of what they had once had. Julian was endlessly patient. He listened to Alistair's anger, to his fear, to his grief for the life they had lost. He never got defensive. He just listened, and he apologized. He apologized for his ambition, for his blindness, for the pain he had caused. And Alistair, in turn, began to forgive. He forgave Julian, and perhaps more importantly, he forgave himself. He forgave himself for his pride, for his fear, for the letter he never sent. He began to understand that they were both just young and scared. Two people who had loved each other immensely but hadn't yet learned how to love each other well. Finn, meanwhile, was thriving. The quiet sadness that had always lingered in the corners of his eyes was gone, replaced by a bright, confident joy. He adored Julian, and the bond between them grew stronger every day. Julian taught him about the stars, about the delicate ecosystems of the tide pools, about the scientific method. Alistair taught him how to use a hammer, how to identify different types of wood by their grain, how to find beauty in the quiet, patient work of creating something with his hands. He was a perfect fusion of them both, a living, breathing testament to the love they had once shared and were now slowly rediscovering. About 6 months after their reunion on the pier, Alistair was in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a custom-built cradle for a client. Julian walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and stood for a moment, just watching him work. "That's beautiful," Julian said, running his hand over the smooth, curved wood. "You have such a gift." Alistair smiled, a comfortable, easy smile. "It's what I do." "I have something for you," Julian said, his expression turning serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Alistair's heart stopped. His hands, steady just a moment before, began to tremble. "Jule, what is this?" "Open it," he said softly. Alistair took the box, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were 2 rings. They were simple, elegant bands, one of silver, one of a darker, richer metal, intertwined to form a single, seamless circle. They were his wedding rings, the ones he had put in the wooden box under his bed and tried to forget for 8 years. "How did you get these?" Alistair whispered. His voice choked. "Finn," Julian said with a small smile. "He came to me last week. He said he had something very important to give me. He'd taken them from the box under your bed. He said he thought we should have them back. He said people who are married should wear their rings." Alistair laughed through the tears that were now streaming down his face. Of course it was Finn, their wise, perceptive, wonderful son. Julian took the rings from the box. He took Alistair's left hand, his touch warm and sure, and slid one of the rings onto his finger. It was a perfect fit. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are the love of my life. You are my home. You are my greatest discovery. Will you marry me again?" Alistair was crying too hard to speak. He just nodded, a frantic, joyful bobbing of his head. He took the other ring and, with a shaking hand, slid it onto Julian's finger. "Yes," he managed to choke out. "Yes, of course, yes." Julian pulled him into his arms, and Alistair buried his face in his shoulder. The scent of him, the solid feel of him, a perfect, beautiful reality. They weren't the same 2 young men who had first exchanged these rings. They were older, scarred, and infinitely wiser. They had lost each other, and in doing so, had found themselves. And now they were finding their way back to each other, not to recreate the past, but to build a new future, a future that was big enough for all their dreams. A month later, they were married. It wasn't in a stuffy courthouse, but on the beach at sunset, the same beach where they had sat and watched their son chase the waves. Finn was the ring bearer, carrying the intertwined rings on a cushion of moss he'd collected himself. He was also the best man, the maid of honor, and the entire wedding party. It was just the 3 of them, and a local fisherman who was also a licensed officiant. As they said their vows they had written themselves, Vows that spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, of the enduring, resilient power of love. Alistair looked at Julian, his husband, and at Finn, their son, standing between them, holding both their hands. The sun was setting, the sky was on fire, and the ocean was calm and steady. And Alistair Finchthorne knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the storm was finally over. The life he was living now was more beautiful than any he had ever dared to dream. It wasn't a life he had built to keep the storms out. It was a life he had built to weather them together. And it was perfect.